So while they're doing that, how many of you all know Heather Halter? Some of you may have met her or not. She's the documentation person and responsible for a couple of people who do the documentation. So she and I chatted at OpenSearchCon in Seattle at length last year about the state of the documentation, the work that's happening. So this kind of came from that conversation. And then earlier this year, we were chit-chatting. So, all right. Yeah.
So how do you find great results on Google? You type in, how do I... And one of the tricks is to add the word Reddit at the end of your query, because somebody on Reddit has probably figured it out. Now, how do we solve a similar problem when searching for OpenSearch documentation? We type in, how do I, and what's the word we add at the end to find how to do this thing in OpenSearch? Anyone? Sorry, what was that? Elastic.
Exactly.
Not great. So we need to do better. And I think documentation is often a massive failing of open source projects in general. We all know that. Developers hate writing docs. So we've got a modest proposal, perhaps, to try and improve this.
So as I mentioned, right, Heather sort of leads the documentation team. And if you're on OpenSearch Slack, there's a # documentation channel that you can join and ask questions, drop in comments. There's actually a ton of work that happens around documentation. I subscribe to the documentation GitHub repo. I get all the emails. There's a lot of work that's happening. But I think one of the challenges is that OpenSearch is evolving so quickly, and there's always, every 6 weeks we get a new release. And there's maybe a little bit of a disconnect between the people who write the code and then the people who write the documentation, and then those of us who are early adopters, and then those of us who are new to OpenSearch and wondering, how do I do something? And so I think we're interested in how we could have better docs. So if you have a laptop or a phone, I want you to Google for the Divio system, D-I-V-I-O. It brags that it is a grand unified theory of documentation. And documentation is broken up into 4 big areas. We have tutorials, and these are very learning-oriented. And I don't know that we have great tutorials in the OpenSearch project. I mean, there's some blog posts, there are companies with ideas, building plugins and things that have it, but it's a little all over the place, and a lot of it's a little bit out of date. How-to guides, right? So I want to solve a problem. How do I do this? These should probably be very opinionated, right? Like, this is the right way to do this. Not, these are all the ways you could do it, but this is the right way. For people coming to OpenSearch who maybe you've been on the relevance side, like me, and you're learning more about log analytics and policies for indexes, why is OpenSearch written the way it is, right? What is its history? That sort of explanation, right? I don't know that we have enough of those types of documents. And then lastly, and probably where we're the best, but maybe it's not as helpful, is reference information, right? Here are all the options. Here are all the switches. Here is what a command looks like. Here's a long list of options, right? We have those all pretty well covered, but sometimes I look at all those options and I'm like, which one do I use? Why do I need those? So if you looked up the Divio system, it has its sort of theory about that. We'd be really interested. So any other sort of ideas and questions? I mean, any experiences that you all have had with the documentation or ideas where we could improve? So kind of would love some feedback or ideas.
Raise your hand. Okay, great, thank you.
Thanks. So one of the main problems we have always is, okay, I found something, and this is for version 1, for version 2, is for Elastic 7, is for... I don't know. So, and I don't know how to solve that, to be honest.
That's actually a great one. Often when I Google, I end up on an old version. HT access files, things like that might help us tell Google to look at the latest one.
To steal an idea from Solar, the Solar docs, the version number's kind of baked into the path, the URL, if you're looking at Solar docs. So you can tell when you're looking at a particular web page, this is for version 852, and usually you can skip to the version you've got by just changing the numbers in the URL. So maybe just encoding that into the URL might be an idea. I don't know if that's possible.
Next one is right here, and I'm already here.
And I'll try not to break a plate. Hello. Regarding documentation, so my experience is when you're Googling for solutions, you talked about how to use processes and whatever. If I find like a GitHub issue and it solves my problem, great, I leave it at that, fixes it and move on. But what I probably should do is like, hey, I think we should update the docs on something that represents this answer, especially if it's got 100 thumbs up. Rather than for the next person to find us on Google search GitHub issues, maybe we should move that to the docs.
That's an interesting idea, right? Like looking for GitHub issues that get lots of thumbs up for some reason, and they're probably the documentation you wanted was there. That's a great suggestion. What's preventing you from opening up a PR?
I have a 2-year-old son, and he basically doesn't want me to do any work at night. I don't know if that's
It's a valid
Great
reason.
answer. Great answer.
Next one is already here.
So basically, just to follow up on finding the answer on GitHub or on GitLab or whatever open source repository in which you can get answers from a community, backwards compatibility. For example, when you go further down versions and you change the config in which you're trying to identify why isn't this working? It used to work. I've updated. Now it's not working. Nobody has the documentation. So why, when changing versions, we break the previous one just because of changing the version? We are adding new features, which is great, but we still need to be able to support the people who are using the tool beforehand. Not a matter of documentation, might be a matter of process, but it's still something to take into account, I suppose. And when it comes to documentation around OpenSearch, personally, when I'm troubleshooting it, I get quite annoyed about how, when I'm using the APIs, for example, I'm doing the API, I'm getting the results back, and I'm like, okay, where is the item I'm looking for? The documentation said is there. Is not. So again, it goes back to versioning. So it's just more food for thought, I suppose.
Thank you.
Very good one. So raise your hands. Who also wants to give some opinion? I'm coming. So.
Thank you. These are very, very important and valid ideas, and I'd like to address the point that you mentioned that developers don't like to code. I think historically that's correct, but today with the tools and the capabilities of auto generation of documentation using whatever it's Cloud AI or OpenAI, any other capabilities, we can actually leverage the developers' attention to help the documentation part instead of doing everything manually to assist with these generating tools. So they have a very good point of start or draft, so we can then give that draft to the documentation, and then the documentation has to change only very minor parts. That's what at least I'm trying to do.
Yeah. One thing I'll highlight that was new to me when I got involved with OpenSearch is that there's actually a tool used to do syntax checking and language checking, and it's almost like continuous integration testing of the text you're using to make sure you're using the right grammar and everything, which was kind of cool.
There is also checks for the links. If the links are invalid or not valid, you can do this with CI/CD. Next person, raise your hands. Yes? Do I see something here? Okay, last one.
A quick question. Is the OpenSearch documentation searched, indexed into OpenSearch?
It is. It's an older OpenSearch, and not totally sure who to talk to upgrade it. DB, if he's here, I think is one of the two names on the maintainer. So yeah, it is its own search. It needs some help. It needs some relevancy work. I love that we're using our own tools for search, but it definitely needs to get a lot more effective.
Just a quick follow-up comment. So I'm also evaluating Vespa for my use cases, and Vespa, of course, like advertises heavily that they use their own system for their own documentation search, and it works pretty well. So usually I am able to reach what I want based on use cases that I have in mind using Vespa search faster than I can get through to them through Google. The only thing is I think that all this CI/CD verification of documentation quality is not so much employed at Vespa.
Right.
But I think combining these two things, you could even.
I would love to see a vector search implementation or a hybrid search in our own docs, right? And some of these other ideas that people have on how to improve search quality using our own documentation as the example.
Yeah, you're not just testing the documentation, you're then also testing the capability of the search engine. So it's a win-win as far as we're concerned. I think Chris said this is something they're working on and looking at.
Who wants to build this with us?